Again, welcome everybody. This is Jeff Letterman with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. I'm with our Fish and Wildlife Outreach Group, and today is the 119th episode of our Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We're really excited today to talk about catch and release fishing. Hopefully you're getting a chance to get out, try some fishing this summer, and hopefully you're going to get a big one. And today we'll kind of focus on especially larger fish and appropriate handling of them and the best way to keep them healthy and safe. So I'm really excited to welcome today Tony Sindt is our Minnesota River Specialist at the DNR and Fisheries, and he's going to go over some really great ideas and tips and things to think about if you're fishing, and especially if you want to release some of those big fish. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here, and I will share my screen here right now. And just let me know as soon as you can see it, and I'll get started.
It looks great.
Awesome. All right, so like Jeff said, I'm gonna talk about catch and release angling today. Kind of a little background about what catch and release angling is, or what we mean by that, and then focus on some tips for successfully practicing catch and release angling. And so when I say catch and release angling, that's, when you are intentionally catching and then purposely or intentionally releasing a fish, as opposed to catching and intentionally keeping a fish, which is typically being harvested for food, but there's other reasons why someone might keep a fish, such as mounting a trophy on the wall. Before I go any further, I also want to point out that, we're going to focus on catch and release angling today, but that's not to suggest that there's anything wrong with catch and harvest. In fact, I encourage people to take advantage of the renewable resource that is our fisheries, enjoying a healthy source of protein and healthy fats. So nothing wrong with catch and harvest, but many anglers choose to do catch and release angling, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And there's also times when we're required to do catch and release angling. Why do people catch and release fish? Well, one reason is because there might be regulations in place. So for example, here in Minnesota, I have a snippet here from our regulation book. We have many regulations that require releasing fish of certain sizes or during certain seasons. For example, for largemouth and smallmouth bass, we have various seasons or times a year when the regulation is for catch and release only, where the fish must be immediately released. And also, if you look in the fishing regulation book, you'll see a definition for immediately released, which means the fish are only retained long enough to unhook, measure, and photograph. Fish not immediately released are counted as part of an angler's daily and possession limit. So during a catch and release season, as an angler, if you catch that species, you're required to simply unhook it, measure it, and release it. The other reason people might release fish is because they just voluntarily do so. And there's kind of two types of voluntary release, at least in my opinion. One, an angler might be interested in keeping fish for a meal or harvesting fish for some other reason, but they might catch a size of fish that's undesirable for harvesting, or a different species that they don't want to harvest, so they choose to let those fish go, or they might be concerned about the safety of eating a particular fish. And then there's kind of what I would consider voluntary conservation, and that's where anglers are catching and then releasing a fish with the hopes that the fish will get bigger and get caught again by another angler or by themselves, or they want to do what's best to conserve the fish population, or they might just simply enjoy catching fish and have no interest in harvesting fish. And really, the concept of catch and release angling is, relatively new over the last 100+ years. So pre-1900, most recreational fishing, and I say recreational fishing is in opposed to commercial fishing, was really harvest oriented. Most people were fishing for the purpose of catching fish for food. And then during the 20th century, the use of catch and release regulations became more popular by fisheries managers trying to manage these recreational fisheries. And along with that came an increased use or increased participation in voluntary catch and release by anglers, to the point now where it's very common for people to go fishing with entirely motivated by catch and release and no interest in harvest. When you think about catch and release angling, one thing at least that pops into my mind is bass tournaments or bass fishing are really popular species to target for catch and release angling. And most or all tournaments are catch and release based. However, the first catch and release bass tournament wasn't until 1972. Prior to that, bass tournaments were catch and harvest. And even more recently, the Minnesota DNR kind of began further recognizing this interest in catch and release angling and started acknowledging and recognizing catch and release records for fish species that are caught and released. And I'll talk more about this a little bit later. So I mentioned catch and release as a management tool or a reason why people might have to catch and release a fish. And so catch and release angling can really be effective for improving or maintaining trophy fisheries. And this is especially true for long-lived species that are in low abundance, or what we often consider trophy species, such as big flathead catfish, lake sturgeon, muskies, big lake trout, and so on. Catch and release angling and regulations can also be really valuable for protecting vulnerable fish or during vulnerable times of the year, such as during the spawning season or during times of year when they congregate or aggregate in large groups, and can also be effective for protecting really heavily pressured fisheries such as small urban fishing ponds. And catch and release regulations can certainly reduce and shift harvest. However, catch and release angling as a regulation and in general as a practice really only works if the fish survives after it's released. It's kind of an obvious point there. And so that leads into the catch and release concept. So the general concept of catching and then releasing a fish is the intention that the fish that is released will survive and then grow to hopefully either reproduce or to get caught again by another angler. And this is often true and a good intention. But unfortunately, just because a fish swims away once it's released after being caught, doesn't necessarily mean that it will survive long term. And this brings up the terminologies of instantaneous and delayed mortality. So instantaneous mortality is obvious when you're unable to release a fish alive. You might give it such a mortal wound when being hooked, say in its gill, that the fish dies right away, and then you're obviously unable to release that fish alive. That's opposed to delayed mortality, which is when you release a fish, it seems healthy, it swims away, but ultimately as a result of the stressors or injuries from being caught, it ends up dying in the future. And there's a handful of factors that are well known to be positively correlated with delayed fish mortality. And so we'll talk kind of in depth about several of these factors. So the first one is the length of the fight or the length of the time fighting the fish. And this is really analogous to exhaustion. The longer you fight a fish, the more exhausted and stressed out it can become. We all know that fish breathe in water. And so the other factor is the time out of water. So the longer the fish is out of the water, the more physiological stressful that is, and ultimately can lead to essentially the suffocation of a fish. We also know that for most fish species, the warmer the water temperature when the fish is caught, the more likely it is to experience delayed mortality. Also, for many fish species, the deeper the fish is caught can result in greater chance of delayed mortality. And this is what's called barotrauma, when a fish is brought up from deep water and experiences the barotrauma. And then obviously, the greater the physical injury. So oftentimes a small hook wound in the jaw of a fish is not very problematic, is unlikely to cause the death or delayed mortality of a fish. But sometimes fish are hooked in an unfortunate location, like in the gills or somewhere else that might cause it to bleed out directly from the trauma, or potentially create a wound that can become infected. And that can also ultimately lead to its death. And so this leads to the point of the direct or indirect effects that can lead to the delayed mortality of a fish. So for example, if a fish is mortally wounded and bleeds out, that'd be a direct cause of delayed or instantaneous mortality. Whereas if you fight a fish a long time and it's exhausted, you might release it, it swims away. It might not die just from that exhaustion, but because it's so exhausted, it might be unable to avoid predators and then is indirectly killed through predation, where another fish or a bird like a loon ends up eating it. So this concept of delayed mortality has been pretty heavily studied by fisheries biologists for a long time. There's lots of published studies and literature looking into this topic, and I just grabbed a couple examples here to highlight that highlight some of the more extreme instances or examples of delayed mortality. So for instance, there's a study by Sindt et al. Where they looked at delayed mortality of lake trout in Lake Superior and Lake Huron. And they found that delayed mortality could be quite high when water temperatures or the surface temperature exceeded 61 degrees, with delayed mortality at over 75% in Lake Huron. Another study by Schramm et al. In 2010 found that during walleye tournaments that had live weigh-ins, the delayed mortality could be up to 100% of the fish, especially when the fish were caught from deep water and surface temperatures exceeded 65 degrees. So again, this is bringing into some of those factors I mentioned earlier about the depth at which fish are caught, and the warmer the water, the more likely delayed mortality is. And the last study here is a little bit closer to home from South Dakota. They did a study with ice fishing and found that 37% of walleyes caught through the ice from deeper than 40 foot experienced delayed mortality. And again, that's resulting from the effects of barotrauma. So I mentioned all these factors that can lead to greater chance of delayed mortality of a fish during the instance of being caught and released. And I don't want to scare everybody. It's not like every fish you catch is going to die ultimately. It's typically a combination of many of those factors that can cumulatively lead to stresses that might result in mortality. However, most of the time you catch and release a fish, they'll survive. But I'm going to talk about some of the considerations anglers can take associated with these factors to help maximize the likelihood the fish will survive. And that's typically the goal of catch and release anglers, is they want the fish to survive. So the first factor is the length of the fight, or the duration the fish is being fought. And this one's pretty easy to mitigate the effects of by using the appropriately sized gear for landing the fish being targeted. So obviously you would use different fishing equipment if you're targeting, small panfish as opposed to, say, 100-pound lake sturgeon. So you just want to use a strong enough rod, reel, heavy enough line, adequate hooks for quickly fighting and landing the species you're targeting. And also use appropriately sized nets or other landing devices so you can quickly and safely land the fish, get them unhooked and released back into the water quickly. The second factor, and in my opinion, maybe the easiest factor to mitigate the risks of, is the time out of water. So basically just keeping the fish in the water as much as possible maximizes the probability the fish will survive. So just being quick and efficient during the process of releasing a fish is great. One tip is when you land a fish in a net, you can leave the fish in the water in the net while you get things ready to complete the release or take a picture, maximizing the time in the water again. And then when you're fishing and plan on releasing fish, having tools like pliers and scissors and having a camera and measuring device readily available helps you be really efficient. You catch a fish, put it in the net, keep it in the water. You can unhook the fish in the water over the side of the boat or from the bank. And then you can take it out really quickly for a picture, maybe a quick measurement, and let it go. And ideally, and hopefully you're able to complete that process in under 60 seconds. The third factor is water temperature that we talked about. And this is probably one of the hardest factors to mitigate because we are unable to control the temperature that the water is or what the weather is. So unfortunately, if you really don't plan on harvesting fish and you want to practice catch and release during the hottest part of the summer when surface temperatures are really warm, it's probably best to avoid targeting some of the more sensitive fish species like muskies and lake trout and walleyes, and maybe focus on fishing for fish species that are living in the shallower, warmer water to begin with, like bass and sunfish and crappies. And then, especially when it's hot out, you can avoid fishing in deeper water, where you'd be bringing fish up from deep, cold water to warm surface water, and focus more on fishing in the shallower water that's already warm. Because a lot of times it's that drastic change in water temperature that can be stressful on the fish, going from the cold, deep water to the shallow, warm water. The fourth factor, again, is water depth or barotrauma. And this is a popular topic in saltwater fisheries or in the ocean where fish are often being caught out of really deep water. Hence this infographic from NOAA on the slide. But it applies to freshwater fish also. Many fish species that we fish for here in Minnesota, from bass and crappies and sunfish and walleyes, uh, are really impacted by barotrauma, especially when they're caught out of water that's deeper than 30 foot. And so if you're going to fish for fish that are that deep, really I just suggest focusing on harvesting those fish, because released fish are going to have a much lower chance of surviving. However, there are some species that are referred to as physostomes that have the ability to empty their swim bladder through their mouth to avoid barotrauma. And this includes catfishes and sturgeon and salmonids and muskies. Those species aren't as susceptible to barotrauma, but again, it's more of the bass, crappie, sunfish, walleyes that are most negatively impacted by being caught from deep water. And the fifth factor is physical trauma or physical injury. And this, is summarized just by respecting and taking care of the fish you catch, and taking a few steps to minimize unnecessary harm to them. So one thing you can do is, use artificial lures or quick hook set devices to avoid deeply hooking fish. If you're bobber fishing and plan on releasing the fish you catch, it's probably best not to let them, take the bobber under for 10, 15 seconds first. That's more likely to lead to a deeply hooked fish. You can use circle hooks or barbless hooks to minimize the hooking wounds. If a fish is hooked too deeply, or you're concerned that you'll do more damage by trying to remove the hook, it is okay to just simply cut the hook or cut the line. Obviously, if you don't plan on harvesting a fish, it's probably best not to put them on a stringer. If you're ice fishing, one thing that people often don't think about is that the sub-freezing temperatures in the air can cause fish's fins and eyes to freeze up rather quickly. So if it's really cold outside and you're ice fishing, it's best to release the fish very quickly, or be inside of a heated shelter. And then one of the most important factors when handling fish for catch and release is protecting the fish's slime coat. All fish have a slime coat over their body that's very important for them to protect them from infection. And so doing things like using an appropriate rubber or knotless net that's more gentle on the fish's slime coat than a knotted nylon net. Obviously don't let a fish flop around on the carpet of your boat or on the dirt on the bank, because that can damage the fish's slime coat. And kind of jumping along with physical injury is what I'm calling factor 5B here, is the handling of the fish. So you also want to protect the fish's slime coat. You want to handle fish with wet hands or wet gloves. And obviously avoid grabbing sensitive parts of the fish, such as the gills or the eyes. Fish's eyes and gills were not meant for supporting the entire weight of their body. It's important to, hold fish gently, but you want to hold them firmly enough so you're not going to drop them on the ground. Small fish like bass and crappies They're relatively easy to handle. You can hold them vertically by their jaw with relatively little damage or stress on their bodies. But larger fish, I'd say probably anything over 10 pounds, like a big catfish or a muskie, really needs to be held horizontally, supporting the weight of the fish with two hands. Their bodies just really aren't meant for being hung vertically by just a jaw or a gill plate. And the last factor is just how you can best help a fish recover. I often see anglers that, they really want to release a fish healthy, and they might have a fairly exhausted big fish that they caught, and they think swishing the fish back and forth in the water might maximize the amount of water that flows over the gills. But the reality is that fish gills really only work one direction when the water flows through the mouth and over the gills. So if you want to help a fish recover over the side of the boat or along the side of the bank, don't swish them back and forth, but just simply hold them upright in the water. They're usually pretty good at passing the water over their gills on their own. And if you really want, you can gently move them in a forward direction in kind of an S or a figure eight shape to help pass water through their mouth and over their gills. And then simply just hold the fish, in the water for a minute or two, basically letting them catch their breath per se. And then you'll feel when they're ready to swim away. So I just covered, a good handful of tips associated with each of these factors that can help maximize the chance a fish will survive after being caught. And I'm going to kind of play a video here that'll kind of go over some of those factors and have a particular emphasis on big fish, because obviously handling, say, a small bluegill and releasing it quickly is a little bit different than handling, say, a 40-pound catfish and trying to get a picture and release it quickly and safely. So I will play this video, just a couple minutes long, and then I have a few more tips I'll talk about after the video.
Hi, my name is Tony Sindt. I'm a fisheries specialist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Today we're out on the Minnesota River, which is a popular destination for anglers coming to catch trophy-sized flathead catfish and channel catfish, among many other fish species. Oftentimes, anglers enjoy catching and releasing large trophy-sized fish in hopes that the fish will survive and grow so it can be caught again in the future. So today I'm going to share several tips and demonstrate ways of handling and releasing large fish that maximize the likelihood of the fish surviving after it's released. These general tips apply for most large fish species such as muskies and lake sturgeon, but today we're going to focus on catfish since we're on the Minnesota River. All right, so the first tip for ensuring the healthy release of a large fish is landing the fish quickly with a rod, reel, and line adequate for the size fish being caught. And then, of course, having equipment ready for landing and releasing the fish, such as a large knotless or rubber landing net, pliers for unhooking the fish, and of course a camera for capturing the memory. So the second and probably most important tip is minimizing the amount of time the fish is out of the water. Ideally that would be less than 30 seconds. So landing the fish in a big net like this is great for holding the fish in the water while you remove the hook, get your pliers or camera ready, and ideally you could just remove the hook from the fish right here in the net, and then the fish is ready to be released or taken out of the water for a picture. So a great way of measuring a fish without taking it out of the water is using a soft tape measure like this and measuring the fish in the net or alongside the boat. So the third step is protecting the fish's slime coat, and you do that by always handling the fish with wet hands or wet gloves and keeping the fish off of dry surfaces such as the carpet at the bottom of your boat or the sand and mud on the riverbank. So the next tip is holding the large fish properly. With most large fish, you want to hold them horizontally, supporting the entire weight of the fish's body. So with catfish, you can usually use one hand to grip the lower or upper jaw, and then use the other hand and arm to support the weight of the fish's body, holding the fish horizontally. And then you can quickly release the fish back into the net or into the water. Gripping the lower jaw is a great way of holding smaller fish such as bass, crappies, and even small catfish. But holding larger and heavier fish by the lower jaw puts way too much stress on the fish's jaw, and hanging large fish vertically stresses the muscles and connective tissues and compresses internal organs. If the fish doesn't swim away right away, you can hold the fish in the water to let it recover. Fish gills operate best when the water flows through the mouth over the gills. So you simply want to hold the fish with its mouth open into the current, or move the fish in a gentle S shape, passing water through its mouth over its gills. And once it's ready, you can let it swim away. All right, so once you're holding the fish properly, you're ready for a quick picture. And then you can quickly release the fish, relatively unharmed, and ready to be caught again another day. Good luck. Hope you catch a fish of a lifetime soon.
All right, so hopefully that video helped kind of reinforce some of the tips I talked about already. So the next tips I have are just kind of some helpful tips and instructions for how to properly measure or weigh a fish that you catch and then want to release. So kind of like the video just talked about, have a measuring board or a soft tape measure readily accessible. Wet the surface before you lay a fish on it to measure it. And for most fish species, the official way to measure a length is from the tip of the snout, typically pushed up against a hard surface, making sure it's right at 0, to the tip of the tail fin with the tail fin pinched. As that video showed, a great way to measure a fish in the water is with a soft tape measure, and that really just gives you a good approximation of the length of a fish, because you really need to measure a fish on the flat, straight surface. If you take a soft tape measure, and lay it across the body of the fish, that's obviously going to inflate the length a little bit because you're measuring part of the curvature of the body. Smaller fish can be weighed pretty easily on fishing scales. However, I would recommend avoid using the ones that require puncturing the fish's mouth with a hook. They make lots of neat little jaw gripping devices on fish scales these days that are much better for the fish. And larger fish, I'd say anything over 10 pounds, it's really not ideal to weigh them in that fashion where you just hook them on the mouth and hang their whole body weight. That's going to do damage to the fish's jaws and potentially some of their internal organs and skeletal structure. So if you really need to weigh a larger fish, it's typically best to weigh them inside of a net or in some sort of other container on more of a flat weighing scale. And then you can tare the weight of the net or that container to be able to safely weigh a large fish. Often when we're practicing catch and release angling, we're targeting bigger trophy size fish. We want to capture those memories, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it's great to have a good photo to have a memory of your catch. So again, just having a camera readily accessible so you can do it quickly is best for the fish. With large fish, as we've talked about, holding them horizontally with 2 hands is safest for the fish. And it also makes, for what I would argue, the best looking pictures. And really taking a good picture of a big fish or even a smaller fish is best when you're just really emphasizing the fish as the focus of the photo. So that's where if you hold the fish horizontally to fill the frame is best. And then trying to hold the fish in a way where your hands block as little of the fish as possible. That helps emphasize the fish and not your hands. And this photo here I use as an example because this angler did a great job of holding the fish safely and horizontally, but also holding it in a way that its hands are not blocking the fish. It's good to hold the fish out from your body, but not too far. You don't want to look like you're straining to keep the fish out as far away as possible. And I'm by no means a photography expert, but certainly the lighting and the sun angle can impact the quality of a photo. And what I do know is that when the sun is directly behind the person or the fish, it often results in a poor, washed out looking photo. So it's best to avoid that. Lastly, I just want to touch on Minnesota DNR's catch and release record program that I mentioned early on. This started in 2016, where the Minnesota DNR began recognizing records for fish that were caught and released and this is in addition to there being certified weight records for fish that are caught and harvested. Currently, this program is just limited to a handful of species, some of the larger trophy species like flathead catfish and northern pike. But this is likely going to get expanded to many more fish species in the near future. And this program is pretty simple. It basically just requires photographic evidence of the fish that was caught and of the measurement of the fish. It does require having a witness that can sign off that they witnessed the catch, the measurement, and the release. And kind of that I talked about as tips for measuring fish is that the measurement must be a straight line measurement of the length of the fish from the tip of its snout to the tip of its tail, not using the contours of the fish. So that's pretty much what I have for tips today. Hopefully I shared some interesting tidbits about catch and release angling and some tips that can help you maximize the chance that the fish you release will survive so it can be caught again or reproduce and be another trophy someday. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Thanks, Tony. That's great information. I love hosting these and working on these webinars because I always learn something. I mean, I've been angling for a long time and have typically released a lot of fish, and you've got me committed to carrying my net with me every time I go out. So that's a really, really important tip. And one thing I learned. We do have over 50 folks that have participated in the webinar today. So again, if you have questions, if you'd like to chat with Tony today, please put your question in the Q&A, and we have quite a bit of time. We can answer a lot of those. So please get those in the Q&A. And then Tony, you have your name, your email, I should say, up there. You welcome folks to reach out to you if they
yes,
have
please
other
do.
questions.
Any questions?
Okay.
Yep.
Great. And if you want to stop sharing here in a few seconds, then we'll jump into the questions. We do have one already, but Sally wanted to know is surface temperature and depth taken into account to allow tournaments to occur under more stressful conditions? Or I think she's maybe asking if there are permits or restrictions on some of those tournaments.
Yeah, that's a good question. And and unfortunately, I don't remember all the details of the permitting implications, but I do know that we do take that in consideration. And it's really more so the time of year, which correlates with the water temperature and what we permit for tournaments. So oftentimes we will not allow catch and release tournaments for certain species during the warmest time of the year. And if people want to have tournaments, they have to have them as catch and harvest, because of the chance of those fish surviving after being released is too low.
And you talked about some of the history of tournaments, and I'm really excited to see that a lot of, especially the bass tournaments, I think are going to this catch photo release or some way that they record the length, and they're actually doing tournaments based on length, not weight. So the fish are released immediately, which I think is a great way to help protect our fish, and something that I have a large family, and we always try to sometimes do some little competitions, and we've gone strictly that way too. It's just really a lot healthier for the fish, I think, over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the increased use of everyone having a smartphone or a cell phone makes it possible for people to be able to do real-time measurements and release fish and document the, location and get a picture of the measurement. And yeah, it's a super effective way for continuing to conduct tournaments, but being able to release fish right away. It's great.
Camille asked, what gloves do you recommend for handling fish?
That's a good question. I would say anything that's more of a smoother surface, and then just having them wet when you handle fish is best. But it's kind of a trade-off, because if you don't want your hands to be too slippery where the fish is going to slip out of your hands and flop all over the ground. So you need to find what works best for you as far as being able to still be able to handle the fish without dropping it. But obviously if you have like sandpaper gloves, they'd be grippy, but are probably going to do more damage to the fish. So I don't have a particular product that I can endorse or say works best. I personally use some pretty smooth gloves when I'm using gloves that other people have said are too slippery for them, but I'm able to, handle the fish well with them. And I think it helps protect their slime coat best.
Sally has another question about tips for handling toothy fish, especially muskies and northerns.
Yeah, and that's a good question, and it's tricky handling very toothy fish, especially when they're very large. The best tips I can give are, again, trying to keep the fish in the water as much as possible, and that's, if you're able to keep the fish in the water, keep your hands away from being inside of its mouth, have a good long needle nose pliers that you can potentially unhook the fish over the side of the boat or over the shore in the net in the water. Um, and then you basically can avoid having to have your hands anywhere near the sharp teeth. Obviously, most people are probably familiar. They make little jaw spreading tools for holding a northern pike's mouth open for unhooking the fish. Because obviously, if you tried doing that with your fingers, you would probably be cut up pretty good. But you can also get gloves that are, some stronger cut resistant gloves that can be helpful too.
And I think you mentioned this in your talk, but I think a really important part, and not just for muskies and northerns, but is to get that hook out before you even try to pick it up. Because you hear many stories, especially if you're dealing with treble hooks, where folks grab the fish and pull it in or are trying to take a photo and they still have the lure attached to the fish and it shakes and all of a sudden you got a lot more trouble with that hook stuck in you.
Exactly.
Smaller northerns, the ones that are less than a few pounds, it is pretty easy to grab them behind, squeeze them right, behind the gills from the top, and you can handle a northern fairly well that way. But as they get larger, I mean, if they get to 4 or 5, even I have a hard time holding on to them that way. And I know you see a lot of photos of people reaching up underneath the gill cover and holding the bottom of the gill, which is relatively safe, I think, for the fish, but that's a technique that you got to know what you're doing because, like you said, you got all those teeth in there. They can move and get and then they also, folks I don't think know, the back of the gills have these rakers, which are really sharp too, and can cut your hand up or anything like that pretty well too. So, yeah, it's best to keep them in the water and using that definitely.
Yeah.
Kim was wondering what happens if you catch a muskie and it is severely injured or bleeding, and or do you still release it? And I guess this applies to fish out of season and things like that. So how do you answer that?
Yeah. So, we, as I talked about, we use catch and release as a regulation. So there's seasons for fish or size limits for fish. So if you catch a muskie and it's under the 54-inch minimum length, we're required to let it go. And there's rare instances where you might have mortally wounded a fish in the process of being caught, where you really don't think it's going to survive, but it's illegal to harvest. And the unfortunate reality is that we still have to release that fish because it's outside of our regulation to be able to keep it. Fortunately, I think that instance is pretty rare when it happens, but yes, it would need to be released. Now, if it's within season or a legal size, so it's a large enough fish, and you really don't think it's going to survive, then I would strongly encourage harvesting of fish, just to make best use of that resource rather than returning a dead fish to the water.
But we do have these slot limits on many of our species and things like that folks, unfortunately. But the good news is those fish will provide resources back to the environment, the circle of life, and whether it's a turtle or an eagle, most likely a lot of those that will become food for something else. So
Yep, exactly.
We talked a little bit about barotrauma, and actually, it was Josh we had on a few weeks ago about catching fish in Lake Superior, and so we've actually, in the case of trout in Lake Superior, changed those rules a little bit so that, there are no slot limits because of the risk of those fish being damaged from coming up from deeper water, which happens a lot where they're in the deeper water during the summertime. Do you have any other barotrauma stories or research on that at all?
I don't have any particular stories, but it seems to be a growing field of study for freshwater fisheries. I think especially as ice fishing is becoming more popular, and people are targeting fish, in deeper water in the winter, especially species like walleyes and crappies that can be regularly found in 30+ foot of water in the winter. There's been a lot more research on it, and we're finding out that, yeah, those fish that are caught from 30+ feet deep, at least probably a quarter of them, if not significantly more, aren't going to survive after they're released. And I don't think, I think there's been people are looking at ways to minimize or ways to release them and still have them survive, like um, you know bringing them up slowly per se, or taking other steps, but it doesn't seem like that's really a great solution. So the reality is, if you're catching, crappies or bluegills or bass or walleyes out of 30+ foot of water, you should plan on keeping them, because there's a good chance they won't survive. And hopefully there's just going to be some more and more research coming out to provide further guidance, maybe some specific depths or depths and temperature combinations. And maybe there will be some discoveries of ways to alleviate this issue. But for the most part, probably just avoid fishing for fish that deep if you don't plan on keeping them.
Thanks. Last call for questions. I think we've covered all of them so far, but if we have a few more minutes, so if folks have anything else you want to ask about or talk about related to this topic, please throw that question in the Q&A. But I while we're waiting for that, I was thinking we could talk a little bit more about temperatures and how important that was. I know you mentioned previously that muskies in particular, which is surprising to me, because you think of them being a little bit warmer fish, at least warmer water fish, at least compared to northerns. But you said they're pretty susceptible during really hot weather, hot temperatures also.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's the physiology of the muskie that specifically the temperature's the issue. I think it's probably the combination of being a bigger fish.
Okay.
Because all fish are going to be more stressed out in warmer water. And so it's the combination of the factors of the time of the fight, how exhausted the fish is, how warm the water is, what was the temperature at the depth the fish was caught from. So oftentimes in the summer, the muskies are using deeper water. They're chasing, ciscos or other bait fish. And so you're fighting them a long time because they're a big fish. You're bringing them up from colder, deeper water up to very warm surface water. And just that combination is really often lethal for big muskies. And I think the same is true for many other large species, and especially those that prefer cooler water, where you're bringing them up from deep water, deep cold water to warm surface water. Kind of opposed to that would be, I would say, like flathead catfish, which inhabit rivers where the temperature is pretty constant throughout the depths. They're well acclimated to the warmer temperature, so they still can get stressed out from being caught, but the temperature component is probably not as big of a shock on their system because they're not being brought from cold, deep water to warm, shallow water.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you also, if you ask anglers like what's the most fun fish to catch, a lot of times they'll say muskies, because I think they just exert themselves incredibly. I mean, they're famous for jumping, and they just go wild when you catch them, and they're fun. But I think they probably per fish or whatever, they exert maybe a lot more energy trying to
Yeah.
get away.
Notoriously, muskies, they get exhausted, and they can take a little while to swim away after being caught.
Mhm.
And so, just taking as many steps as possible to maximize survival is best. And one of those factors that negatively affects that is water temperature.
Well, I don't see any other questions. Craig or Benji, speak up if we missed anything, but I think we covered pretty much all of them. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, hopefully people got some good tips today and learned a little bit about catch and release fishing. And I hope everyone has success out on the water catching fish, whether they choose to keep them and harvest them or release them. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Well, we really thank you for being here today, Tony, and thank you to all the participants. We had a really good crowd today on a really nice, cooler day, which is a great summer day out here in Minnesota. But we do have this program going on every week. Next week, hopefully you folks can come back and see our next episode, which is actually about fawn deer, white-tailed deer fawn, and the research that one of our colleagues is doing in within wildlife, and some of our with the team that's been looking at fawns and how we can study them using some new technologies like drones and what we're learning from that. So it'll be a really fascinating talk next week. So sign up again through the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship page on our website. If you go do a search for Minnesota Outdoor Skills on mndnr.gov, you can find that, and then all of the recorded videos, including this one. So thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and thanks, Tony, for being with us today.
You bet.